Bigger has decided to go get the job. He's going to an area which is a suburb of Chicago, which is like him traveling from North Philly out to Abington for this job. So if you can try to imagine how difficult it was going to be for him to be in a strange area with people it is that don't look anything like him. And when I'm saying Abington, I'm not even talking about Abington now. I'm talking about Abington back maybe 20, 30 years ago, maybe 40 years ago, when the only people who lived out in Abington were Caucasians. Okay, so this is the 1940s in a suburb of Chicago, and he was going there to go get a job to be a chauffeur for this family named the Daltons. Okay, so Mr. Dalton is the husband, he's a rich man. Mrs. Dalton is his wife, and she's blind. Okay, she can't see anything. Then Mary Dalton is his daughter. And Mary Dalton is somebody who is sort of kind of a hipster. She is somebody who's down for the cause. She wants to help poor people. She wants to help black people and everything like that. And she really wants to be down. So where we pick up is that they went to a bar in the hood. Mary told her father she was going to the library to go study and she wanted Bigger to drop her to the library. However, she ended up going to this bar in the hood where they have singing and dancing and everything like that because she wanted to go to some place where she'd be able, see some folks, some black folks. And she wanted to be a part of the hood. Okay, so she is there with her boyfriend. Her boyfriend's name is Dan. Okay, yes, Dan, not Dan, I'm sorry, Jan. Jan is her boyfriend's name, Jan. And so while it's a girl's name, never mind, let me stop. Okay, so she is there in the car and they're leaving the place. Um, and so she said, when I see what they've done to those people, it makes me so mad. Yes, it's awful. And I feel so helpless and useless. I want to do something. I knew all along you'd come through. Say, Jan, do you know many Negroes? I want to meet some. I don't know any very well, but you'll meet them when you get in the party. The party that they're talking about is the Communist Party, which at some point in time was illegal and be folks were not supposed to be a part of the party. Okay, so so she says we can't have a revolution without them. They've got to be organized. They've got spirit. They'll give the party something it needs. And their song, the spiritual, aren't they marvelous? Bigger saw her turn to him. Say, Bigger, can you sing? I can't sing, he said. Oh, Bigger, she said, pouting. She tilted her head and closed her eyes and opened up her mouth and said, swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Come on, Bigger, and help us sing it. Jan said, I can't sing, he said again. They were silent. The car purred along. Then he heard Jan speaking in low tones. Where's the bottle? Right here. I want a sip. I'll take one too, honey. Going heavy tonight, ain't you? As heavy as you. They laughed. Bigger drove in silence. He heard the faint musical gurgle of the liquor. Jan, what? That was a big sip. Here, you get even. Through the rear mirror, he saw her hit the bottle and drank. Maybe Bigger wants another one, Jan asked him. Oh, say, Bigger. Here, take a swig. He slowed the car and reached back for the bottle. He tilted it twice, taking huge swallows. Wow, Mary laughed. You took a big swig, all right. So, at this point in time, Bigger is behind the wheel of the car, of her father's car, and he's drinking along with them. Okay, Mary and Jan are in the back of the back seat of the car, drunk, and Bigger is in the front seat, drinking in 1940s Chicago with a white woman and a white man in the car. Okay, he's a black man. Okay, so keep all of this in mind. Okay, so a long time passed. It's 1 o'clock, honey, Mary said. I'd better go in. Okay, let's drive a little more. It's great here. Father says I'm a bad girl. I'm sorry, darling. I'll call you in the morning before I go. What time? Oh, about 8:30. But I hate to see you go to Detroit. I hate to go, but I got to. You see, honey, I got to make up for being bad with you down with Florida. I got to do what mother and father say for a while. I hate to see you go just the same. I'll be back in a couple of days. A couple of days is a long time. You're silly, but you're sweet, she said, laughing and kissing him. You better drive on, Jan called. Bigger drove out of the park on Cottage Grove Avenue, and so he drove Jan to where his bus stop was. Well, they called them streetcars back then. So he said, "Here comes my car," Jan said, turning to peer through the rearview mirror. "Oh, gee, honey, you've got such a long way to go. If I had time, I'd ride you home. But I've been out so late as it is that Mama's going to get. I'm going to be suspicious. Don't worry, I'll be all right. Oh, say, Bigger. Let Bigger drive you home. Nonsense. Why should he have to drive me all that distance at this time of the morning? You better take this car, honey." Okay, so they driving. Jan gets out the car and they drink a little bit more. And so now it's just Bigger and her in the car. Okay. She decides that she wants to sit in the front seat with him. So she got into the front seat. The streetcar clanged to a stop. Jan swung onto it. It started north. Bigger drove toward Drexel Boulevard. Mary slumped down in the seat inside. Her legs sprawled wide apart. The car rolled along. Bigger's head was spinning. "You're very nice, Bigger," she said. He looked at her. Her face was pasty white. Her eyes was glassy. She was very drunk. "I don't know," he said. "My, but you say the funniest things." "Maybe," he said. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You don't mind, do you?" "I don't mind." "You know, for 3 hours you haven't said yes or no." She doubled up with laughter. He tightened with hate. Again, she was looking inside of him. He didn't like it. She sat up and dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. He kept his eyes straight ahead of him and swung onto the car in the driveway and brought it to a stop. He got out and opened the door. She did not move. Her eyes were closed. "We're here." She tried to get up out. She tried to get up out of the car seat, and she slipped back down. "Aw, shucks." She's drunk, really drunk, Bigger thought. She stretched out her hand. "Here, give me a lift. I'm wobbly." She was resting on the small. She was resting on the small of her back, and her dress was pulled up so far that he could see where her stockings ended on her thighs. He stood looking at her for a moment. She raised her eyes and looked at him. She laughed. "Help me, Bigger. I'm stuck." He helped her, and his hands felt the softness of her body as she stepped to the ground. Her dark eyes looked at him feverishly from deep sockets. Her hair was in his face, filling him with its scent. He gritted his teeth, feeling a little dizzy. "Where's my hat? I dropped it somewhere." She swayed as she spoke. He tightened his arms around her, holding her up. He looked around, and her hat was lying on the running board. "Here it is." As he picked it up, he wondered what a white man would think seeing him here with her like this. Suppose old man Dalton saw him now. Apprehensively, he looked up at the big house. It was dark and silent. Well, Mary said, I suppose I should go to bed. He turned her loose, but had to catch her again, and to keep her off the pavement. He led her to the steps. Can you make it? She looked at him as though she had been challenged. Sure, turn me loose. He took his arm from her and she mounted the steps firmly and then stumbled loudly on the wooden porch. Bigger made a move toward her, but stopped. His hands outstretched, frozen with fear. Good God, she'll wake up everybody. She was half bent over, bent on one knee, one hand, and one hand looking back at him, amused in astonishment. This girl is crazy. She pulled up and walked slowly back down the steps, holding on to the railing. She swayed before him, smiling. I sure am drunk. He watched her with a mingled feeling of helplessness, admiration, and hate. If her father saw him with her now, his job would be over. But she was beautiful, slender, with an air that made him feel that she did not hate him with the hate of all other white people. But for all that, she was white and he hated her. She closed her eyes slowly and opened them. She was trying desperately to take a hold of herself. Since she was not able to get to her room alone, ought he have called Mr. Dalton or Peggy? No, that would betray her. And two, in spite of his hate for her, he was excited, standing here watching her like this. Her eyes closed again, and she swayed toward him, and he caught her. I'd better help you. Let's go the back way, Bigger. I'll stumble sure as hell and wake up everybody if we go up the front. Her feet dragged on the concrete as he led her toward the basement. He switched on the light, supporting her with his free hand. I didn't know I was so drunk. He led her slowly up the narrow steps to the kitchen door, his hand circling her waist with the tips of his fingers, feeling the soft swelling of her breast. Each second, she was leaning more heavily against him. Try to stand up, he whispered fiercely, and then they reached the kitchen door. He was thinking that perhaps Mrs. Dalton was standing in her flowing white, staring with stony blind eyes in the middle of the floor. Again, don't forget that Mrs. Dalton is blind. The kitchen was empty and dark, save for a faint blue hazy light that seeped through the window from the winter sky. Come on. She pulled heavily on him, her arm around his neck. He pushed the door in and took a step inside. And waiting and listening, he felt her hair brush his lips. His skin glowed warm and his muscles flexed. He looked at her face in the dim light. His senses were drunk with the odor of her hair and her skin. He stood for a minute and then whispered in excitement and fear, Come on, you've got to get to your room. He held her out in the hallway, and they walked a few steps and they went into the empty hallway, and he was trying to figure out where her room was, but she was too drunk to try to tell him exactly where the room was. So you have to try to imagine the house where all the bedroom doors are closed. He doesn't know his way around the house at all, and he's trying to figure out how it is that he's going to get this girl back to her room. And she's extremely drunk, and she can't really talk or anything. So he is really, really stuck. And he said, Where's your room? She didn't answer. She was completely out. Where's your room? He asked again. She rolled her eyes toward the door. He got as far as the door and stopped. Was this really her room? Was she too drunk to know? Suppose he'd open up the door to Mr. and Mrs. Dalton's room. Okay, so that happened, and said, now, here, wake up now. She was trying to wake up, and he couldn't, so they went inside of the room that she had said was her room, and when they got into the bedroom, he still was trying to wake her up. He lifted her up and he laid her on the bed. Something urged him to leave at once, but he leaned over her, excited, looking at her face in the dim light, not wanting to take his hands from her breast. Kissing her softly, he felt her move toward him. He was aware of her body now. His lips trembled. Then he stiffened. The door behind him creaked. He turned and hysterical terror seized him. Though he were falling from a great height in a dream, a white blur was standing by the door, silent, ghost-like. It filled his eyes and it gripped his body. It was Mrs. Dalton. He wanted to knock her out of the way and bolt from the room. Mary, she spoke silently. She spoke softly, questioningly. Bigger held his breath. Mary mumbled again. He bent over her. His fist clenched in fear. He knew that Mrs. Dalton could not see him, but he knew that if Mary spoke, she would come to the side of the bed and discover him, touch him. He waited tensely, afraid to move, for fear of bumping into something in the dark and betraying his presence. Mary, the mother said. He felt Mary trying to rise and quickly pushed her head back to the pillow. She must be asleep, Mrs. Dalton mumbled. He wanted to move from the bed, but was afraid that he would stumble over something and Mrs. Dalton would hear him. Okay, so Mary's mom is calling again. Mary, is that you? He clenched his teeth and held his breath, intimidated to the core by the awesome white blur floating toward him. His muscles flexed and taut as steel as he pressed the pillow and feeling the bed give slowly, evenly but silently. Then suddenly her fingernails did not bite into his wrist. He had taken the pillow and put it over her face to try to get her to shut up. And suddenly Mary's fingers loosened. He did not feel her surging and heaving against him. Her body was still. Mary, is that you? He could see Mrs. Dalton plainly now. He took his hands from the pillow and he heard a long, slow sigh go up from the bed into the air in the darkened room, a sigh which afterwards he remembered it seemed final, irrevocable. Mary, are you ill? He stood up and with each of her movements toward the bed, his body made a movement to match hers to get away from her. Mary, are you asleep? I heard you moving about. Mrs. Dalton straightened suddenly and took a quick step back. You're dead drunk. You stink with whiskey. She stood silently in the hazy blue light, and then she knelt at the side of the bed. Bigger heard her whispering. She's praying. She's praying? Finally, Mrs. Dalton stood up and her face tilted in the upward angle which she also always held it. And he waited, his teeth clamped and his fist clenched. She moved silently toward the door. He could scarcely see her now. The door creaked and then silent. He relaxed and he sank to the floor, his breath going in a long gasp. He was weak and wet with sweat. He stayed crouched and bent, hearing the sound of his breathing, feeling the darkness. Gradually and intensely, the intensity of his sensations subsided and he was aware of the room. He stood and he listened. Mrs. Dalton. So let me pick up. Okay, so he's in the room and he stood and he listened. Mrs. Dalton might be out there in the hallway. How could he get out the room? He all but shuddered with the intensity of his loathing for this house and all it had made him feel since he had first come into it. He reached his hand behind him and touched the wall. He was glad to have something solid at his back. He looked at the shadowy bed and remembered Mary as some person he had not seen in a long time. She was still there. Had he hurt her? He went to the bed and stooped and stood over her. Her face lay sideways on the pillow. His hand moved toward her, but then it stopped in midair. He blinked his eyes and stared at Mary's face. It was darker than when he had first bent over her. Her mouth was open and her eyes bulged glassily. Her bosom. Her bosom. Her bosom wasn't moving. He could not hear her breath coming and going now as he had when he had first brought her into the room. Coming and going now. He bent and moved her head with his hands and found that she was relaxed and limp. He snatched his hand away. Thought and feeling were balked in him. There was something he was trying to tell himself desperately but could not. Then convulsively he sucked in his breath, and huge words formed slowly, ringing in his ears. She's dead. Okay. So this is the point where the movie truly takes, where the book takes a turn and where the movie's going to take a turn. Um, he had killed her. He didn't realize he had killed her. And then next thing you know, this chick is dead and he's not sure of what to do, how to handle it. So I'm going to actually just tell you what happens. He skips forward, and he's trying to figure out how to dispose of the body because, again, he's depending on this job. So in his dependence for the job, he doesn't want anybody to find out that he killed her. So he actually takes the body, puts it in a trunk, takes it downstairs to the basement, and puts her inside the furnace. However, when he attempts to put her inside the furnace, everything can't fit inside the furnace. Her body fit in, but her head did not. So he makes a decision to cut her head off and fits her all the way inside of the furnace. But in his infinite wisdom, he did not take her jewelry off. He didn't take her earrings off or anything like that. And the heat from the furnace was able to do a lot, but it couldn't burn everything. So that leads us to the rest of the story.